Upper St. John's River Basin's been covered. Indian River Lagoon's been covered. We're going to be covering, I think, the Everglades coming up here after my talk. I am not going to talk about wetland restoration in a strict sense. I am instead going to talk about a bird, a duck, and a really, really cool duck, at least to a guy who's been working with the bird for almost 20 years. A duck that uses, based on the information and the understanding we have now about their habitat use patterns, all of these systems in the state of Florida. The duck I'm talking about, a lot of you already know from the title slide, I gave it away, is the Florida mottled duck. I've been working with this bird for a long, long time. For those of you who don't know much about this bird, I'll go through a little bit quick life history or ecological information about this bird. It is a genetically distinct subspecies, at least as far as I'm concerned. The AOU, the American Ornithologist Union, does not recognize a subspecies of mottled duck. Mottled ducks occur in Texas and Louisiana, here in Florida, and they also occur now in South Carolina and Georgia because we put them there, not because they were there on their own. But a lot of the genetics work we've done, and we've done a lot over the years, shows that our birds here in Florida are genetically distinct from those that occur in Texas and Louisiana. And there's a lot of other data as well, plumage data. They look different. They're ecologically different. I consider them at least a subspecies. We're finishing up some additional genetics work right now on this, on the comparison between Western Gulf Coast birds and our birds here in Florida. And maybe we might even have a species, a separate species. So we'll see where that goes. It is Florida's only endemic duck, so that makes it even more special. And then we've got the fact that it is non-migratory. It doesn't leave Florida, never leaves Florida. That means it has to find everything it needs to survive right here in peninsular Florida. And of course that then lends to the importance of having very, very good and functional wetland systems for this bird to survive here in Florida. So all this stuff we're talking about today, all this restoration effort, all this conservation effort of shallow water wetland systems in Florida is very, very important to a species like the Florida mottled duck. Spring population size of this bird is about 50,000, okay? Compare that to mallards, Jamie. I mean, what, 8 million, 12 million, 16 million, 20 million birds in North America? We've got 50,000 of these birds in the spring population, the breeding population. Not very many. Makes them vulnerable, potentially, to things that change on the landscape, on their landscape. Degradation of wetlands is one of them. So we've got a really unique bird here. And what I want to talk about today is their habitat use patterns and kind of relate that then to what this symposium or this summit or conference is all about and talking about wetland restoration and conservation. Habitat use, what we know about this bird's habitat use patterns has really been bolstered by two major research projects that I've been involved with over the last 15 years or so. One was in the Upper St. John's River Basin, and the most recent one was in South Florida. These were radiotelemetry projects. You know, we love to tinker. You know, we love to use technology, and technology is great. We just heard the talk before this about some really cool technology that's going to help us figure out what's going on in the Indian River Lagoon. Well, we're using a little bit of technology on the birds themselves, radiotelemetry. During these two projects, we radio marked over 300 adult female mottled ducks, and we garnered over 20,000 locations for these birds over the 6 years or so that these two projects encompassed. All right, well, we'll talk a little bit about the telemetry, okay, first, before we talk about habitat use patterns. Now, Jamie, you got to look up, man. Jamie, you got to look up. Look up. Okay. Before we could put radio transmitters in these birds, we had to catch them, of course. Okay, and this is one of our main duck catchers right here, and he's sitting right up here in front, Mr. Jamie Feddersen. He's now, going from this, okay, to now the leader of the waterfowl and small game program in FWC. Okay, you see how this goes? Man, I'm telling you.
I think that picture was taken in the first week that I worked with the commission.
We had other really good people working on these projects to catch our birds. Andrew Fanning, are you in the room? Didn't have a picture. He's all the way in the back there. Without these two guys getting out in the marshes and catching these birds for us for these projects, we wouldn't even gotten off the ground. We also had a lot of great technicians. I had a great graduate student from Auburn University named Dana Varno work on the second project in South Florida. So there's a lot of people involved in this. But anyway, once we caught the birds, we implanted them with radio transmitters. These are not, some of you may have seen ducks or other birds, backpacks, kind of like your kids wear to school or whatever, type transmitters. We did not use backpack transmitters. We used implants. It's about the size of a AA battery, maybe a little bit bigger. The cool thing about the transmitters we used is this whip antenna here comes to the outside of the bird. Okay, so the transmitter's in their abdominal cavity, but the antenna's on the outside, just like on your truck, a whip antenna. It allowed us to hear the transmitters from a much greater distance than if it was a wholly internal transmitter package. Okay, so we could keep track of our birds without too much trouble. There's always a little bit of trouble when you're trying to track down wildlife, but it made it a whole lot easier. Like I said, it's a surgical procedure. So once the birds were anesthetized, we opened up their abdominal cavity, we implanted the transmitter, sewed them back up, and once they recovered from anesthesia, we let them go back where we caught them. And then we started tracking them from the air and from the ground. And that's how we garnered those 20,000 or so locations that we got through the two projects. Talk a little bit more in depth about the St. Johns River Basin project first. This project was conducted between 1999 and 2002, and we got a lot of locations. This is just for reference, the Upper St. Johns River Basin. We've seen maps like this several times, graphics like this several times already today. This is Blue Cypress Lake. This is the Indian River Lagoon. This is the basin. T.M. Goodwin is somewhere in here. Stick Marsh, all that kind of stuff is in here. We caught a lot of our birds in those areas. Okay, lots of use early on in the project. Again, between 1999 and 2002 is when this project was going on. And early on, birds used pretty much moved up and down, north and south within the basin. They also used a lot of areas on the periphery, these pasture areas that have a lot of discrete ponds on them, and they use those quite a bit as well. The thing that happened during this project, which made it really, really interesting and more difficult in many ways, is that if those of you were around in 1999, 2000, 2001, 2002, it was a really big drought, a really severe drought that occurred, okay? Basically, what happened toward the end of 1999 into 2000 and into 2001 is all of the wetlands, the ephemeral shallow water wetlands that these birds were using in the basin dried up. And as they dried up, what our birds did is they moved from here and in toward the coast. Okay, so they went into urban suburban areas along here, and a lot of them actually went all the way to the lagoon. Show you a little bit about the types of habitats here. This is the T.M. Goodwin Waterfowl Management Area. So these are the habitats these birds were using when they were flooded. This is a really, really good example, in my mind, of what great mottled duck habitat looks like. Okay, a lot of emergent vegetation, submergent vegetation, and then interspersed water. Like Steve Rockwood talked about first thing this morning, this is the kind of mosaic that you're trying to create out there in these shallow water areas, and this is the kind of stuff that mottled ducks love. So then they move inland, or coastward, during the drought, and this is what they start to use. Okay, pretty different types of habitats than what they found out in the basin. Okay, not a lot of emergent vegetation in here. During the drought, though, these ponds were pretty darn low. Even these areas got low. Okay, these birds moved out of the dried up areas. They had to find water somewhere. This is where they were finding it. So they did have a little more structure to them than what you see here. But a lot of the birds we would find would be along these areas here, along these grassy banks. People were feeding them popcorn and bread and corn, stuff like that. They loved it. Okay, did very well in there. And we've got actually survival data and reproductive data for birds in urban suburban areas that we got from our South Florida study that show that survival rates and reproductive rates of mottled ducks in urban suburban areas are actually a lot higher than in the rural areas. Okay, but anyway, there are some gems in here, though. You can see some remnant pieces of what were probably more natural ponds, and they still existed. And the birds that moved into these areas actually used those kinds of habitats as well. When they went to the lagoon, again, shallow water habitats along the shorelines, along spoil islands, natural islands. And here's one of those mosquito impoundments that was talked about, Merritt Island talk this morning. They use these habitats quite a bit as well. These are impounded areas, again, to control the salt marsh mosquitoes, and they would use those kinds of habitats. So my point here, and kind of relating back to wetland conservation in peninsular Florida, is that these birds use a variety of habitat types, a variety of wetland systems in the state. So everything that's being done in these systems, the talks we heard about today about improving the upper St. Johns River Basin, working on greatly improving, I hope, the Indian River Lagoon system over time, is going to have a very positive impact on this species. Okay, it's a species that will benefit from just about any kind of shallow water wetland improvement or conservation that happens in Florida, in peninsular Florida. Now, I am a researcher, and so I had to put up a table or something, right? So I did. Real world, Len, what do you do with the data? What we're spending this money, we're working on these birds. What does this data? What's the application? Okay. Well, here's just one example. This is from the St. Johns River Basin study from a paper I published back in 2006. And this is the mortality rates associated with different factors that these birds encounter, different agents, if you will. The two that I want you to focus on here are alligators and hunters. Now, I'm going to preface this right now. I'm not saying hunting is bad on these birds, okay? But this is just an example of when wetland systems change, in this case because of drought, some things that can happen, the impact that these birds can see and feel, and then how we might want to use the data that we gathered and react. Okay, 1999-2000. This is toward the end of 99 and into 2000 is when the drought really started taking impact on the basin. And that's when these areas were drying up. And they dried up really, really fast. I mean, these places just whooshed. The water was going, gone. And what ended up happening, you can see here the mortality rates during this period because of alligators and because of hunters were really high relative to subsequent years of the study. Okay, 30-some percent, 20-some percent, and then almost dropping off to nothing later in the study. And what was happening as the waters were drying up on the St. Johns River Basin, these marshes, the birds that use the St. Johns River Basin, these marshes of the St. Johns are their critical base, is how I feel. They need these things, they use them. When it's flooded, they use them extensively. As it was drying up, so they don't want to leave necessarily. So as they start to dry up, these birds got concentrated into these small remaining bodies of water. So did the alligators. And when the hunters went out there to hunt in those areas, they're looking for ducks. Oh, they found ducks. Okay, they found ducks concentrated on these remaining water bodies as well. So the mottled ducks took it on the chin a little bit. Okay. Later on, as the drought was in full impact and those areas were dry, the birds had to move. They moved. Okay, they moved away from the alligators, they moved away from the hunters into those urban suburban areas, onto the lagoon, and the mortality from these factors basically dropped off. Okay, so what does this really mean? Well, it means that in conservation, when we look at enhancement and conservation in the upper St. Johns River Basin, I would suggest that it might be good. These areas need to dry, like Steve was saying. They need to dry to stay productive. But the dry downs, if you can prolong them, if it's not a dry down that just really comes on fast, where these birds are scrambling out there concentrating themselves, if it comes on more gradually, these birds are going to filter out and have a chance to adapt, and you're not going to see these heavy mortality rates, these high mortality rates, if we can extend these dry down periods during drought and things like that. So this is just a quick little example about actually using these data that we do gather, the money that we're spending to get these data, and how we might interpret them and try to make a change on the landscape in these restoration efforts that we're doing, enhancement efforts like on the St. Johns. Okay, between 2008 and 2011, we did another study, very similar to the one we did up in the St. Johns River Basin. The design of this study was influenced quite a bit by what we found in the upper St. Johns River Basin study. The big thing is that we found these birds moving from these more rural areas into these urban suburban areas during drought. So we were thinking, well, you know what? It might be good from the very beginning to just go ahead and try to mark two separate groups of birds. And that's what we did. Excuse me. We marked an urban set of birds and a rural set of birds. Okay, this is Lake Okeechobee, obviously. Everglades agricultural area, water conservation areas, urban suburban habitats around West Palm Beach. So we marked 2 groups of birds in this study. Really interesting what we found when we make these comparisons and habitat use patterns between these urban birds and these rural birds. Let's talk about the rural birds first. All of these locations, not these are our urban birds. All of these locations here are from our rural marked birds, birds we caught in rural areas, okay? Just like in the Upper St. Johns River Basin, they use a bunch of different kinds of wetlands and a bunch of different wetland systems, okay? Examples, west marshes of Lake Okeechobee. It's what general look of that kind of habitat during the study. Very similar, lots of emergent vegetation, submergent vegetation, open water areas. When they moved these birds out into the pastures here, they use these discrete type ponds a lot, very similar to what's up in the Upper St. Johns River Basin along the periphery of the basin there. Ditch areas that are often associated with these discrete wetlands, they use those a lot. The Everglades agricultural area habitats themselves were used a lot. I mean, it was really kind of shocking to me. We knew that they used them during, this is a flooded ag field in the ag area, and all the lateral ditches and stuff that occur out there. To mottled ducks, these ditches are like just really long, thin, emergent wetlands, and they used them. And we knew they used them during molt, things like that, because we go down there every year, right, Jamie, and catch a bunch of birds out there for our banding projects on this species. They use them other times, too, during the breeding season, believe it or not, which was just a shock, really, to me. The STAs, the stormwater treatment areas that have been constructed around the Everglades agricultural areas, the area down there to basically as part of the restoration of the Everglades, very similar to what you saw up on T.M. Goodwin and things like that. These are impounded wetlands, 10 minutes. So they love these things, and they use them extensively throughout the entire project, all times of the year. Hello? Uh-oh, we're slowing down here. The actual Everglades, water conservation area south of Lake Okeechobee, birds use these areas quite heavily. They stayed away from the really dense sawgrass areas and sought out these sloughy type habitats for the most part that occur in that area. Hello? There we go. Okay. So, again, just like in the Upper St. Johns River Basin, a lot of different types of wetlands, very similar in structure for the most part, a lot of different systems. The pattern that they used these different areas over their annual cycle was interesting as well, and that's what I want to go over next. This area here is where we caught most of our birds. These are the STAs, the stormwater treatment area. We caught most of our birds, August, Jamie, right? We're catching them when they're molting. They can't fly. Okay, so when we put them back into the areas where we caught them after we implanted their transmitters, we had to wait a while before we saw any movements at all. Okay, so basically we radio marked them in August, but if you go ahead in time a little bit to late October to late November period of the study, of this particular year of the study, this is when the birds are starting to move again. They're starting to fly again, so we're going to start to see what these birds, types of habitats they're going to use during this time of the year. And you can see some birds are already starting to spread out from the STAs where we caught them when they were molting, out to the western marshes of Lake Okeechobee, some birds starting to go out into the pasture areas, the ponds and the ditches out there. If you move forward to the beginning of the breeding season for that group of radio-marked birds, you can see a big change. So I'll just kind of flick back and forth here. You can see what's happening. Yep, we got more birds up on the marshes, more birds out into the pasture areas, birds starting to move up the Kissimmee River Basin. But look what's happening. We got a bunch of birds starting to use the Everglades water conservation areas, which was a shocker to me for this time of year. We didn't really think prior to this study that mottled ducks really used the Everglades water conservation areas to any great extent at all. If you move on into the breeding season proper, and actually toward the late breeding season for this species, you can see another big shift. Out of the Everglades, off the pastures, and now we're getting a bunch of birds concentrating in the Everglades agricultural area proper. Birds nested in here, in these ditches, on these flooded ag fields. They're putting their nests in the sugarcane, okay? Which is really, really just, all this kind of stuff was amazing. Trying to finally understand how this bird moves and uses these habitats. So anyway, that's the rural birds. Moving on quickly to the urban birds, that's it. That's them right there. I'm not going to show you that same graph of them moving around, because guess what? They didn't move at all, basically. The types of habitats they used in there were this. Basically an urban-suburban pond, mowed grass, very little emergent vegetation, some submerged aquatics in there, sitting on the bank, getting fed popcorn and bread and peanuts and stuff like that. They nested in here, they survived in here, they reproduced really well in these types of habitats, believe it or not. Kind of the take-home message that I'm going to drive one more time is that these birds are using all types of habitats, all types of wetlands, and all types of systems, and not just in rural areas, but also in urban areas. And one of the really big surprises was the fact that, well, let me step back. A little graphical demonstration of what I was talking about as far as movements of the urban birds versus the rural birds. This is a sampling of home range sizes or home ranges of rural birds, the blues, and here's a sampling of the home range sizes of the urban birds in the red and pinks. Okay? Hundreds of square kilometers in size for rural birds, their home ranges. Single digits, 2 to 5 square kilometers for urban birds. Okay? They're not moving. They're using very similar types of habitats the whole year, and they're barely moving at all. So, one of the really interesting things, there was a lot of interesting things from this project, was that when you caught a bird in an urban area or a rural area, they stayed in those areas. They didn't cross over, even when some of these interfaces of urban and suburban areas were like just a levee or just a canal. It was rural over here and it was urban suburban over here. The bird that we caught here never moved over here, and the bird we caught there never moved over there, basically. 6% of birds switched the general types of habitats that they used during the project. That is not a lot. It's striking. And this held up even during drought, because we did have 1 year of drought when these birds out here kind of lost their water, but they didn't move into urban areas and suburban areas like we saw up in the upper St. Johns River Basin. Easily understandable, because the whole system down in South Florida is much different than up in the St. Johns River Basin. There's plenty of more permanent water types, wetland types in South Florida that these birds could use during drought, including the marshes of Lake Okeechobee. The SGAs almost always had water in them. They always had water in them. You got the Everglades down here. These are all rural habitats. So when it got dry out here in the pastures, they just moved to these more permanent rural habitats that they could still use. So they didn't move into the urban suburban areas at all. So, quickly, how are we doing, Jamie? We okay on time? 5 minutes still, good. Rural mottled ducks need a diversity of wetland types, and they use a diversity of wetland systems. So everything that's being done to conserve and enhance these types of shallow water wetlands is great for mottled ducks. Urban mottled ducks are living in some kind of fantasy world. You know, they don't do, 10 minutes?
Yep. Mark just gave you 5 minutes.
Oh, man, okay. Well, I can't fill that time, I don't think. But anyway, you know, they don't do the same things. They don't have the same kind of habitat use patterns that the urban birds do. Again, it's a very, very artificial situation in there, but they're doing well in those habitats. And that's the thing. These birds do use rural and urban areas extensively. So anything that we're doing out there on the landscape, in shallow water wetland type systems that's going to enhance and conserve these systems, you're looking at a bird that's going to be able to take advantage of just about everything we do. So all of you that are doing work like this out there, you need to be buoyed up by the fact that there's at least one species of bird out there that's taking advantage of what you're doing, because they love it. They don't care. They're going to use it. Okay? There's lots of other species as well that are taking advantage of it, but the mottled duck is one of them. So I want to conclude with acknowledgments of effort from all the people that were involved in these two projects. Way too many people to name, but without their efforts, there's no way we could have learned what we learned about the ecology of this bird in the upper St. Johns River Basin and in South Florida. We've got a great understanding now of the ecology of this bird in a very, very large chunk of their range here in Florida. The West Coast is still kind of a nebulous kind of thing to us. We haven't done any work over there yet. Maybe we will someday. But we're getting a really good understanding of this bird's ecology in South Florida. So with that, I'll take any questions you got. When's the breeding season? Very protracted. Okay, hold on. It's a very protracted one. We had birds that started nesting in the end of February, as early as the end of February, and all the way through July. Most of the nesting is done, though, April and May. Okay.
If they lose the clutch, will they re-nest?
They will re-nest. They're a mallard. Those of you who know green-headed mallards, northern mallards, whatever you want to call them, they're very, very much like that, it seems, in how they nest and what they do and where they nest. That's a whole nother, talk. But we had birds nesting. They're a mallard, and mallards have been shown to be very adaptable in what they do. And mottled ducks are showing the same thing. They're very adaptable. We've had birds nesting in people's enclosed pool areas. They had a little hole in their screen. They get up in there and they nest in a potted plant. We had them in the landscape islands in Walmart. That's what these birds in these urban areas are doing. Okay, and they're being successful at it. So.
How have you used this information that you've learned to address the hybridization problem?
Well, and this movement stuff is actually very applicable to the hybridization situation with feral mallards. It really explains to me why we even have pure mottled ducks left. Because most of these mallards have been released in urban-suburban situations, okay? And we've got a big core of our mottled duck population that isn't in urban-suburban areas. And these birds that are in these urban-suburban areas don't move out of them. I just showed that. And that's, the way that mallards are going to continue to affect, in my mind anyway, more and more of our mottled duck population is as suburbia creeps out from the coasts into what I consider the core mottled duck, interior core mottled duck range, and people put mallards out onto their properties. Because when people go out there, how do they build their houses? They dig a big old hole, make a big old pedestal to put their house up on so that it doesn't flood. Well, now they got a pond. Okay, ducks like the pond. So then ducks fly into the pond. And then they say, oh, cool, ducks. But they're not there long enough for them, so they're, we'll put some ducks out there. So they buy mallards and they put them out there. That's how mallards are going to get injected into and affect more of the mottled duck population. And that's why, we're kind of at a crossroads as far as I'm concerned, is we need to deal with this now. Because we've been given kind of a grace period here. I've been working on this Jamie and I and Andrew and everybody and Diane Eggman, who was my supervisor for a long time. We've been working on this stuff for 15 years. Way too long, really. We need to get this, and we're at the point now where we're going to collect the data about, trying to figure out what proportion of the birds out there on the landscape are still pure, and try to identify hot spots of hybridization so that we can move forward with trying to deal with this problem.
As hunters, most of us have noticed, I have noticed, most people, that when you're hunting near a suburban area, like around Orlando or whatever, some of the lakes around there,
Yep.
you run into a lot more hybrids than you do if you're out at Barrett Island
Exactly.
or in the St. John River.
Yeah, so hunters that are out there on the landscape, they're finding, they're running into more hybrids and more mallards the closer they are to more populated areas, and that's exactly right. That doesn't surprise me whatsoever. There are birds being put out more, there's birds being put into the urban or into the rural areas as well, but just not nearly the numbers that people have put out onto the landscape in these urban suburban areas. So.
Have you noticed any movement out into seawater, salt water? We have a number of them nesting
Yep.
on the Gulf Barrier Islands.
See, and we have not done much work at all on the West Coast with these birds, really none, to the movement and habitat use kind of stuff. But
The problem we have is that most of them are muddled ducks.
muddled, yeah. But they did use estuarine areas on the East Coast, especially when things got really dry. But in any given year, you're going to see some birds on the Indian River Lagoon.
I've also noticed that there's been an influx of more mottled ducks moving north. Jacksonville, we see a lot of them and stuff.
Yeah.
From before.
Yeah, I mean, the core range is still south of there, I think. We've done extensive surveys on this bird up till around 2009, and we tried to extend, actually, the survey range up further north, but we saw so few birds in those areas that it really wasn't worth the effort to put in survey work up there, so we retracted it again. But there's definitely birds there.
I read there's a
tons.
resident population that was introduced in South Carolina as well.
Oh, yeah. That's a whole nother talk again. Anybody else?
Was the goal of that reintroduction in South Carolina to increase hunting opportunities?
Yep, bolster, put another type of species out there. Yep.
Is it well established?
Pretty well.
Or are they tired?
Yeah, I've actually done some work up there, helping the folks up there do a radio telemetry project on their birds up there, and there's birds there. I mean, you can.
Heavily hybridized?
No, I don't think so. I mean,
Than ours?
no, and those birds have moved their way down the coast over the generations too. We now have the birds that were, the generations past of those birds coming down the coast, and we've got them here in Florida now.
Where did they get they got the birds from here, obviously?
No.
Did they come from the
No, they did not. They got most of the birds, yes, Texas and Louisiana. Few of the birds came from Florida, but most of them came from Texas and
So now
Louisiana.
you got that population.
Yeah. Yep. It's a mess.
See that as being a problem?
Oh, yeah, potentially. You got to understand that when that was done back in the 70s, and they're still not recognized as separate species. Okay, so the people that were grabbing these birds, they're the same birds as here in Florida, and it's going to be close to Florida, so it's no big deal. Only with the genetics, the advances in genetic techniques that we have now, we can actually separate, using rad tag techniques, we can now tell the difference between our birds, Western Gulf Coast birds, and now we're calling the birds up and down the East Coast birds, because even though they're very close to Western Gulf Coast birds, they are a little different, and we're not quite sure, genetically, we're not quite sure why, just because probably the small number of birds that were released in general, so it's kind of an inbreeding thing in a way, that they were different enough now with the high throughput, the high resolution we have on genetics on these birds now, we can actually tell those birds from Western Gulf Coast birds and our birds, so.
So that will be a problem, especially if the species, subspecies gets listed.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion that needs to happen going on.
Is there support in Texas and Louisiana to split?
Yeah, I don't, everybody
That's
that
a
I've,
biological thing.
yeah, everybody, I mean, it is what it is. I mean, everybody I've talked to over there, and I talked to a lot of people about mottled ducks over there, and it is what it is. Just because maybe we don't want them to be separate species for some reason, I do, for the conservation impacts. I mean, when you have a separate species, the weight of doing, of the conservation of that goes way up. So we can vie better for funds for conservation. But there are some issues there potentially. The thing is it's not really our call. They're either different or they're not. And if they are, they are. So you just got to kind of deal with it. It's the way I look at it anyway, We can put our head in the sand if there's some kind of really bad thing that happens because they are separate species. But if they are, they are. If they're not, they're not. I don't know that it's going to go as far as a separate species, the way it's looking right now. In my mind, it might. But subspecies for sure. And we've been recognizing them as a subspecies, I have, here in Florida for many, many years. At one time. Yep, at one time. It just depends on if there's lumpers or splitters up there. Right now we've got lumpers.
The birders would love you if you could get them split.
I guess.
Why not just change all the mottled ducks over there to be the Florida West?
No, those are the Mexican ducks.
Yeah, well, the Mexican ducks look different too. A lot of-
We've got Mexican, it's called the monochromatic
yeah.
mallard species. There's a mallard complex. There's over a dozen species of mallard-like ducks around the world, and our mottled duck is one of them.
You said the mottled duck.
The mottled duck. Yeah, well, we've got those for sure. How are we doing there, Jamie? We good? All right. Thank you so much.